James Murdoch, the influential News Corporation executive, will deliver the MacTaggart Lecture at the Edinburgh Television Festival later this month. It's an eagerly awaited speech. And in this week's profile now, Clive Coleman scrutinises Rupert Murdoch's youngest son.
He's quite a robotic figure. It's almost as if you think, is this man human?
Well, I haven't seen the dark side of him, but I have seen plenty of strength, and Darth Vader had that in spades.
If anything, he's Luke Skywalker. He's a force for good, not for evil.
Here's a question. Why would a hugely successful young executive have a life-size model of Darth Vader outside his office? What might draw such a person to a fictional father figure of enormous power who controls the universe? When the young executive is the very private family man James Murdoch, son of Rupert and the current chairman and CEO of News Corporation in Europe and Asia, you don't need a PhD in psychology to draw some interesting parallels. But to get a real insight into the 36-year-old who oversees News International with its influential titles, The Times, The Sun and others, you need to speak to the head of the family. That's not Father Rupert, by the way. I'm talking about the real head, his grandmother in Australia, Dame Elizabeth.
I had my 100th birthday just recently, and just can't remember whether he came. It's very hard to keep in touch with people when they're around the world, but that can't be helped. You know, one just has to be fond of them and not worry how often you see them. I think he's very able. I think Rupert thinks a lot of him.
We'll come back to that father-son thing in a moment, but not before stopping off at school. Pasquale De Vito taught James history at the Horace Mann School in New York.
I taught him in a course called Religion in History, which is basically an exploration of world spirituality. And I found him to be a genuine explorer of the human condition. We also did a lot of work on sacred space and sacred time. And James was very interested in mountains, sacred mountains. And I remember him being very interested in Tibet.
And what about his physical appearance at that time? Was he the normal preppy kid?
No, he's not the normal preppy kid. He was more like a blithe spirit. You would not see him in a jacket and tie.
A blithe spirit, steeped in spirituality and fascinated by sacred mountains. I wonder how much of that he majored on when he went up for the News Corporation job. As we'll see, James Murdoch is a man of intriguing contradictions. Who would have predicted, for instance, that he'd drop out of Harvard to help set up a hip-hop record label, Raucous Records? Mind you, he was described at the time as a bleach-blonde hipster with various piercings.
They think they're so high and mighty.
The DJ Mighty My was an early signing who saw something new and radical in Raucous.
Well, there was really no other label at the time that was supporting underground music like he was. You know, this was like this powerhouse label that was signing real music. So the artists on it were more artistic than what was out at the time.
So you owe James Murdoch a lot. If you saw him around, you'd buy him a beer, probably.
Definitely. What is he doing now?
Yes, what is he doing now? Oh, I mentioned that, didn't I? Managing a vast chunk of one of the most powerful media organisations on the planet. But he did quite a bit before that. Dawn Airy is the controller of Channel 5, who worked with James Murdoch at BSkyB.
I think he gained a lot of experience, and I think his early years probably showed his wide-ranging sort of interest, whether it was music or cartoons, or indeed I think actually he went on various archaeological digs. I know he's certainly fascinated with the Roman Empire.
Why would a young executive have a fascination with a dynastic empire run by an all-powerful emperor and riven by family rivalries? By 1998, James Murdoch's Raucous Records was making a healthy profit. It was promptly bought by his father and absorbed into News Corporation. James was in the family business, first as boss of the music division, and then its web operation, where he's reputed to have persuaded Rupert to invest in a number of internet ventures, which resulted in significant financial losses. But none of that dimmed his father's faith, and James was made head of Star TV, News Corporation's Asian division, broadcasting mainly in India and China. Rod Eddington is a former CEO of British Airways and a board member at News Corporation.
Everyone was still trying to work out what the relationship between the new media and the old media was, what worked and what didn't work. How did you, as it were, monetize the electronic space? His time in Star in Asia had allowed him to get a real understanding of the potential of satellite TV, so he really did grasp that opportunity.
In spite of that jingle, James Murdoch managed to turn a big loss at Star into a profit. He was helped in part by the Hindi version of Who Wants to Be a Millionaire and the advertising revenues which flowed in. In 2003, he became a director of BSkyB. He clearly understood television in Asia, but what about the UK? Dawn Airy.
I would often have a conversation with him about an episode of The Simpsons as I would about a particular item on Sky News, or he would have been up all night watching Buffy. He is just incredibly accomplished and quite deceptive in terms of his range of interest. But yes, he does understand British television.
Yes, those old British television classics, The Simpsons and Buffy the Vampire Slayer. But it wasn't just his understanding of UK television that impressed Dawn Airy.
You couldn't help but notice him. There was this very tall, willowy, rather handsome, bespectacled, extremely young-looking Murdoch scion wandering the floors. You know, he's a very fit guy, in all senses of the word.
Amidst controversy in late 2007, at the age of 35, he landed his current job.
The most powerful media man in Britain this morning is James Murdoch, not Rupert. His son James has been handing control of the entire Murdoch empire in this country and Europe and Asia.
James has done a great job. Look, I know most people in this industry. I was quite convinced that he had greater qualities of leadership than the other candidates I saw. Some of the names that were originally listed, actually, by the headhunters, I would have been very happy to see get the job, but they weren't available.
The voice of Rupert Murdoch. Both James's sister Elizabeth and his brother Lachlan have worked for their father at News Corporation but decided to leave. So James, who despite being the youngest of the four Murdoch children and having no formal business qualifications, was appointed CEO. But what kind of relationship do Rupert and James have? Michael Wolff is a Vanity Fair columnist. He was given 9 months unprecedented access to the Murdoch family to write the book The Man Who Owns the News, Inside the Secret World of Rupert Murdoch.
His brother Lachlan is the favourite child. His older brother, Rupert, loves Lachlan. Rupert gets almost misty-eyed when you talk about Lachlan. In an interesting way, he's afraid of James. He's impressed by James. He is often cowed by James, is often browbeaten by James. So I think that Rupert probably believes James is the most qualified to fill his chair, but in an ideal world, Rupert would have preferred that it be Lachlan to fill his chair. I think most of all of Rupert Murdoch's children have one thing that is uppermost in their minds, and that's their relationship with their father.
There were concerns, especially amongst shareholders, about nepotism when James was appointed. So, to sort this out and make it all clear, advertising and PR guru Tim Bell was hired.
We went to a great deal of trouble to describe the process of selection, how he got appointed to the job, and make it clear that it wasn't a fix. It wasn't done through nepotism. It was done because he genuinely qualified. What helped was that whenever he had meetings with financial institutions or analysts or the media, they all came away extremely impressed. And so I think it wasn't anywhere near as difficult as we thought it might at first be, simply because of this man's ability.
Well, I think on the shareholder front, you would be worried, wouldn't you, about someone aged 30-ish, right, coming to run a corporation that's that big, you know, that's got revenues in the billions, you know, costs up there in the billions also. The level of risk that needs to be taken, the level of investment that they've had to do in, for example, in getting into broadband, getting into telephony, these are big, big risks. And I'm not surprised that shareholders were nervous about Rupert Murdoch's son coming in to run that kind of thing.
Media analyst Steve Hewlett. But what's James Murdoch's business style? Lord Bell again.
He's very good at listening. He listens to advice. He pays attention to what people say to him, takes people seriously if they say things that are worthwhile. He's certainly not arrogant. He doesn't think he knows the answer to everything. But he approaches it with a considerable self-confidence and with his own view of things as well, which he shares with you.
But if he has a view that people don't agree with, he's not above imposing it.
He introduced a smoking ban in Sky's buildings long before the government introduced the smoking ban, but he, of course, himself smokes. So he and I used to have meetings on the balcony.
There are those contradictions again. Passionately green, James Murdoch has been instrumental in trying to make News Corporation carbon neutral. He's generally regarded as having been a pretty effective chairman and CEO of News Corporation's European and Asian operation. The shareholders have largely been silenced, but there's still a deeply rooted resentment against the Murdoch name. Dawn Airy again.
I think there's a huge amount of prejudice against the surname Murdoch, and it's unfounded. And so, if you have a baggage of prejudice, it's going to be there, whether your Christian name is James, Elizabeth, Lachlan, Prudence, whatever. But I think that, Murdoch, especially in the UK, because it goes back to sort of, Thatcher and Wapping and all of those deep-rooted prejudices of the media.
If there are some who'll simply never forgive James Murdoch his surname, what of the people who've studied his character? He certainly has his admirers, and they regard him as personable and gregarious. But the author Michael Wolff has a very different opinion.
He's not a charming guy. He's not a sympathetic guy. He's not a warm guy. He's not someone who invites you into his home. He's not someone who invites you to be his equal. He's not someone who has a sense of humor, who's not someone who has and can create a sense of intimacy. At dinner parties where James is going to attend, there's a great competition not to sit next to him. And again, this is not because he's a bad person or necessarily a mean-minded person. He's just removed, remote, cold. He lives in another world, and it's a world that is occupied only by people named Murdoch and their spouses.
I think James is not the first to discover that having a famous and successful father puts an extra burden on the child. I mean, James has walked a road that others have had to walk before him, and some have walked it successfully in other walks of life. But I think it was more of a burden to him than it was an opportunity. He had to prove himself twice over, and he's done that.
Rod Eddington. The next few years will see big changes at News Corporation. It'll have to turn this year's net loss of $3.4 billion, based in part on major acquisitions, including the Dow Jones, into a profit. And this week, Rupert Murdoch announced that he's going to start charging readers for online versions of his newspapers. Monetising internet content is the holy grail for all printed media, but it's a high-risk strategy. It's going to require vigour and energy, and with Murdoch Sr. now 78... could the force be with son James to become chairman and CEO of the entire News Corporation universe? Steve Hewlett.
James has got now, pretty decent experience in TV, in pay TV with Sky. He's got quite a lot of business experience been brewing in terms of some quite big risk-taking moves, investment in new ventures, so on and so on and so on. He's now, getting a certain measure of experience in newspapers. I mean, James Murdoch's never going to be a newspaper man in the way that his father is, but in terms of someone who's got all the bits you need to run the empire, I'd have to say, well, certainly of those whose names begin with M, that I don't think there's anyone else really. My guess is that he is the chosen successor.
Profile was presented by Clive Coleman. The producer was Paul Vickers.